Welcome to the darkest corners of human history. What you're about to hear are not fictional horror stories. These are real events that happen to real people. Events so disturbing they seem impossible, but they're documented, verified, and true. Once you hear them, you'll never forget them. History sanitizes the past, making everything seem distant and safe. But the truth is more terrifying than any horror movie, because these things really happened. And they happened to people just like you and me. Here are 10 historical facts that will change how you see the world forever. Fact 1. The Great Pox, living zombies. In 1495, a plague swept across Europe that made the Black Death look merciful. They called it the Great Pox, the first major syphilis epidemic in European history. The disease started with small, painless sores that disappeared, fooling people into thinking they were cured. They weren't. The second stage brought massive, oozing pustules that covered the entire body and released a smell so foul you could detect victims from across the street. But the third stage revealed true horror. Victims were still alive, but their bodies began rotting while they breathed. Their skin disintegrated, falling off in chunks. Their bones became visible through their flesh. Most horrifying of all, their nasal cartilage completely collapsed, leaving gaping holes where their noses used to be. Imagine walking through a medieval city seeing people whose faces had been eaten away by disease, stumbling through streets like living corpses, their lips gone, noses collapsed, skin hanging in tatters. They looked exactly like zombies, except they were real, and they were everywhere. The disease also caused grotesque tumor-like growths called gummas to sprout all over the body, distorting faces and bodies beyond recognition. Many victims lived for months or years in this condition, fully conscious but powerless to stop their bodies from rotting away. Fact 2. The Hinterkaifeck murders, evil in the house. In 1922, at a remote German farmstead called Hinterkaifeck, 6 people were brutally murdered. But that's not the scary part. The scary part is what happened after. The victims were the Gruber family. Andreas, 63, his wife Cecilia, 72, their daughter Victoria, 35, her children Cecilia, 7, and Joseph, 2, plus their maid Maria, who had worked there only one day. The killer used a mattock to bash in their skulls. Then instead of leaving, they decided to stay in the house with the bodies for 3 entire days. During those days, this unknown person lived normally in the house of horrors they'd created. They fed the farm animals, ate food from the kitchen, started fires in the fireplace. They were literally living with 6 rotting corpses, like it was natural. 4 bodies were found carefully stacked in the barn like cordwood. The killer had arranged them, handling each decomposing body like furniture. Here's the nightmare part. 7-year-old Cecilia didn't die immediately. She was alive for hours after being attacked, tearing her own hair out in clumps while lying in the straw, probably in agony and terror, knowing everyone she loved was dead around her. Before the murders, the family experienced terrifying events. Footsteps in the attic when no one was there. A strange newspaper they didn't buy. Footprints in snow leading to a broken door. Their previous maid had quit because she thought the house was haunted. Someone had been watching them, possibly living in their attic for months. The case was never solved. Fact 3. The Dancing Plague, Death by Dancing. In July 1518, something impossible happened in Strasbourg. A woman named Frau Troffea began dancing in the street, not celebrating, just dancing, uncontrollably, for no reason. Then others joined her, not by choice, but because they couldn't help themselves. Within days, 30 people were dancing. Within weeks, hundreds. This wasn't joyful dancing. The dancers moved with violent, spasmodic motions. Their arms thrashed wildly. Their eyes became vacant and expressionless. They cried out for help but couldn't stop moving. Blood pooled in their swollen feet until it overflowed into their shoes, leaving bloody footprints. Their bodies were drenched in sweat. Many had convulsions. Even when they collapsed from exhaustion, they got back up and continued dancing. At the height of the epidemic, 15 people died every day. They died from heart attacks, strokes, and pure exhaustion when their bodies simply couldn't take anymore. Authorities first encouraged more dancing, believing victims could dance themselves free. They hired musicians and built stages. This was catastrophic. More people started dancing. Soon, hundreds were trapped in this nightmare, unable to control their bodies, dancing themselves to death in the streets. The plague continued for months. Nobody knows what caused it. It could happen again tomorrow, and we'd be just as helpless to stop it. Fact 4. The Radium Girls, glowing death. In the early 1900s, radium was considered miraculous. Companies used it for glow-in-the-dark watch dials, hiring young women to paint them. The job seemed perfect. Delicate work with good pay. Companies assured everyone radium was harmless, even healthy. The women were told to use lip pointing, putting brushes in their mouths to create fine tips. They did this hundreds of times daily, literally eating poison. Radium gets absorbed into bones, emitting radiation for life. First came dental problems. Teeth became loose and fell out. Gums developed painful ulcers. Then their jawbones began rotting away. The condition became known as radium jaw. Jawbones would crumble and fall apart, sometimes falling right out of their mouths. The radium made all their bones brittle. They developed anemia as radiation destroyed blood cells. Many became sterile. Tumors grew throughout their bodies. Most chilling, they glowed in the dark. The radium made their hair, skin, even breath luminescent. They were called ghost girls because they literally glowed like spirits. By 1924, 50 women from one plant were seriously ill, 12 dead. Companies refused to admit radium was dangerous, claiming the women died of syphilis to destroy their reputations. They hired fake doctors and suppressed research. These women were murdered by their employers, slowly and deliberately, for profit. Fact 5. The Great Molasses Flood, Sweet Death. On January 15, 1919, Boston's North End experienced something that sounds comical until you understand the reality. A massive tank containing over 2 million gallons of molasses exploded, sending a deadly wave through the crowded neighborhood. This molasses moved at 35 miles per hour, creating a 25-foot-high wall of sticky death. It knocked an elevated train off its tracks, crushed buildings, and picked up horses and carriages, hurling them through the air. When it hit people, it didn't just knock them down. It engulfed them, filling their lungs and suffocating them horribly. 21 people died, trapped and slowly sinking into the sticky mass as it hardened around them like concrete. Rescue workers used saws to cut people out. Some victims were found days later, perfectly preserved in the syrup like insects in amber. The disaster was completely preventable. The tank had been leaking for years, but the company just painted it brown to hide the leaks. Fact 6. Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. In 1991, police entered Jeffrey Dahmer's Milwaukee apartment and found a house of horrors that defied comprehension. The smell hit them first. So overwhelming, officers had to step outside to vomit. In the refrigerator, human heads. In the freezer, human hearts and organs, neatly packaged. On the counter, a human torso. Throughout the apartment, 7 human skulls, 2 complete skeletons, a 57-gallon drum with 3 dismembered torsos dissolved in acid. Most disturbing, evidence Dahmer had been eating his victims. He had recipes for cooking human flesh, seasoning chosen to enhance the flavor of human meat. He'd been cannibalizing people for years. He also kept hundreds of photographs documenting every stage of his murders and dismemberments. He'd photograph victims while alive, while killing them, and after cutting them apart. Dahmer had killed 17 people over a decade, seeming completely normal to neighbors. The apartment building was torn down, but the lot remains empty. Every attempt to build there has failed. Fact 7. The Donner Party, Survival Cannibalism. In 1846, 81 American pioneers became trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains. More than half were children, 6 were infants. When early snowstorms blocked their path, they were forced to wait for spring, but food ran out. First they ate oxen and horses, then leather from shoes and belts. They boiled bones for soup. But eventually people began dying of starvation, and survivors faced a horrible choice: die with dignity or do the unthinkable to stay alive. They chose to live. That meant eating the dead. It started with people who'd already died from starvation. But as more died, the line between survival and murder blurred. Some began looking at the living differently, calculating who would die next and how much meat they'd provide. When rescue parties finally arrived, they found human bones scattered around camps, pots containing human flesh, and children so traumatized they could barely speak. Of 81 people, only 45 survived, carrying psychological scars forever. Fact 8. The Portuguese Corpse Queen. In 14th century Portugal, Prince Pedro fell in love with Inés de Castro, but his father, King Afonso IV, forbade the relationship, and had Inés murdered. When Pedro became king 2 years later, he did something that shocked even the medieval world. Pedro ordered Inés's body exhumed from her grave, dressed in royal robes, and placed on a throne. He declared her his queen and demanded all nobles pay homage to her decomposing corpse. The most horrifying part, Pedro forced every court member to approach the rotting corpse and kiss her hand as a sign of respect. One by one, they pressed their lips to the cold, decaying flesh while their king watched. This wasn't just grief. This was madness on a royal scale, showing how power can corrupt someone so completely they lose all connection to reality. Fact 9. The Britannic's propeller death. The Britannic, sister ship to the Titanic, was designed to be the safest ship ever built. In 1916, serving as a hospital ship, it struck a German mine. The captain, thinking he could beach the ship, ordered full speed toward shore, a fatal mistake that made the ship sink faster. As the ship listed dangerously, 2 lifeboats launched without permission, filled with panicked passengers. But the ship's massive propellers were still turning at full speed, creating a deadly vortex. The lifeboats were caught in the suction and pulled directly into the spinning blades. The propellers, each the size of a building, chopped through the boats like paper. People inside were torn apart instantly, their bodies shredded by the massive blades. Survivors watched in horror as friends and family were literally ground up by the ship's machinery. The water turned red with blood. The only deaths were those who panicked and tried to escape too early, only to be fed into the ship's own propellers. Fact 10. King Tut's dark secret. King Tutankhamun, famous for his golden burial mask, had a dark secret revealed by recent DNA analysis. His parents were brother and sister. This wasn't unusual in ancient Egypt, where royal families practiced incest to keep bloodlines pure. But the genetic consequences were devastating. Tut was born with severe deformities, cleft palate, curved spine, club foot. His immune system was compromised. He died at just 19, probably from complications related to genetic disorders. His body was so frail it couldn't handle ruling an empire. He was essentially a walking genetic disaster, the result of generations of incestuous breeding. DNA analysis of other royal mummies reveals incest was rampant throughout Egyptian royal history. Entire dynasties were built on systematic abuse of children born into predetermined suffering. The golden treasures weren't just symbols of wealth, they were attempts to hide the ugly reality of what the royal family had become. Conclusion. These 10 facts represent just a fraction of the horrors in our history. They remind us that human beings are capable of unimaginable cruelty. The past wasn't simpler or more innocent, it was often more brutal than anything we face today. Most disturbing is how normal the people involved seemed. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a business suit, hides behind tradition, or emerges from desperation. These stories happened. They're documented historical facts proving reality can be more terrifying than any horror story. And perhaps most frightening of all, if these things happened before, they can happen again. The capacity for horror still exists in human nature, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Sweet dreams.